In an unspoken agreement, the reinforcements that came with the Caesar Augustus busied themselves with fending off Melinda's allies. That's a nice mech you got there. Shame about the armor though. It's the Mark Antony, designed by someone I know. It's supposed to be a more affordable alternative to what you're writing. The Caesar Augustus pilot let out a contemptuous snort. The mere thought of cheapening any of this frame's components is abhorrent. It goes against everything this august mech stands for. You and your friend have no idea how much you sullied its grandeur? Like an unstoppable tide, the Caesar Augustus kept closing the distance as it exchanged laser blasts. Melinda's laser cannons were running hot, but the only thing she managed to achieve was to heat up the top layers of her opponent's shield, causing only a fraction of its mass to melt. Its defensive power was a testament to National Aeromotive's heat absorption research. It's useless. Face the inevitability. You talk too much. Melinda yelled as she abandoned her laser fire for a close and approach. Like a nimble gorilla, she threw her mech forward while juking as much shots as she could. The Mark Antony strained against the sudden turns even as the incoming fire heated up a lot of portions of her mech. It made the Mark Antony seem like a demon from hell, with its dark armor, glowing red spots and the ever-present water vapor leaking from the crest of its head. That's a funny gimmick, the Roman helmet design. But I'm afraid you're going to lose it when I hack off your head. The Caesar Augustus came into melee range, but despite the pilot's words, the Augustus continued to charge forward like a train. Melinda only belatedly dodged to the side, suffering a glancing blow from the Augustus' quick slash. The two came together again and engaged in a furious exchange of blows interspersed with opportunistic laser blasts. The Augustus' shield was virtually indestructible as Melinda's dual weapons lacked sufficient weight or sharpness. The white sword struck with measured, disciplined strikes that followed a mysterious pattern. It successfully held Melinda at bay. The pilot of the Caesar Augustus must be an elite. His formal piloting skill overwhelmed her own as he moved the Augustus fluently like it was his own body. From his sword style to his movement pattern, everything the pilot did only put Melinda in a tougher position. Give up. I've seen what your mech is made of. You're an inferior copy. Shut up. Melinda replied as sweat poured down her face. She tried her best to hang on, but the opponent kept chipping away at the HRF plating that kept her mech protected. I can understand why you pilot such garbage. After all, if you don't have the money, you'll never pilot a mech as magnificent as the Caesar Augustus in your lifetime. Not everything can be measured with money. She hissed as she surged forward, risking a deadly stab which she parried with her borrowed sword. Her weapon cracked and broke in half, but it succeeded in taking the wind out of the strike. Her mace already pounced from above, the heavy rounded end traveling in a straight arc towards the Augustus' head. The enemy pilot hastily raised his shield, bouncing the mace back with a heavy vibration. Huh, what will you do now without a sword? This. Melinda dropped the broken sword and used her wrist to fire a couple of point-blank laser blasts right in the eyes. While most of the head was able to endure the heat, the main sensors and the delicate components buried deeper in the head were not so lucky. The enemy pilot screamed as he lost his primary vision. He performed a reflexive bash with his shield that pushed the Mark Antony back. She stepped backwards along with the push and started to slink sideways in order to take advantage of the fact the Augustus now relied on its secondary sensors. You think you've blinded me? You're wrong. Surprisingly, the Augustus shifted adeptly in Melinda's direction. Perhaps wary of another point-blank surprise, the Augustus with its melted head kept its distance while firing its wrist laser. The Mark Antony spent its energy at a fast rate trying to dodge the shots. I've been lenient to you so far. I didn't expect you to scorn my face. Very well, let me show you the real power of the first emperor. The Augustus dropped its shield, relinquishing much of its defensive advantage over the Mark Antony. Nevertheless, the Augustus moved forward with renewed grace. The enhanced speed alarmed Melinda, and it took all she had to dodge the Augustus' masterful sword stroke. The follow-up strikes chipped away at the Mark Antony's exterior, shaving off several portions of its arm and torso armor. Melinda pushed down her panic and kept composed as she danced around with her mech. As each second passed, she felt her conscious mind grow more intense. The Mark Antony's dark form echoed her every thought, allowing her to avoid the Augustus' swords repeatedly. Even in the instances where she couldn't avoid damage, she exerted her utmost to let the sword strike her mech's best armored sections. All you can do is run like a cockroach and jump like a monkey. The pilot bellowed, frustrated at the continual chase. That's all a cheap whore writing a cheap imitation like you can do. You'll never be able to match me and my mech's brilliance. An irrational spike of fury invaded Melinda's thoughts. All her formal guard training warned her not to lose her composure. Having spent a lot of time mediating between hotheads piloting multi-ton war machines, she was well aware of the dangers of letting your anger get the better of your decision-making. The Mark Antony, huh? I suppose you're not familiar with ancient Terran history. You see, way back then, Augustus defeated Mark Antony repeatedly. And now, history will repeat itself. Your cheap joke of a mech will never be as worthy as mine. None of her reservations remained. Indignant at being looked down at, she willingly embraced her anger and howled. The ferocious call stuttered the young pilot's attack, causing him to present an unforgivable gap in his assault. Melinda struck out with her mace with the limits of her mech's capacity, channeling the kinetic energy of her mech's legs, its rotating torso and its entire arm in a single devastating swipe that landed accurately against the Augustus' sword grip. The fingers crunched as the impact of an entire mech's momentum couldn't be stopped by such delicate limbs. The middle and ring fingers even separated entirely. Despite the critical damage, the Augustus was nimble enough to throw its sword to its other hand. Once the Augustus regained its weapon, the Mark Antony would suffer as it overextended itself severely in its last attack. Melinda's eye sharpened as she used the brief moment to do something unorthodox. She engaged the emergency release catches that kept the Mark Antony shoulder launchers attached to its armor. Using the remnants of her mech's forward momentum, she caused her mech to bodily fling the launchers at the gobsmacked Augustus. No matter how much money you have, you can't spend your way to victory. Melinda grinned as she waved goodbye with her mech's free hand. She activated the overrides that caused all the missiles to explode their payloads at once. Twin suns appeared in their midst, blasting the Mark Antony backwards. The explosion further cracked her mech's armor, but she was able to get it to stay on its feet. As the smoke and fire cleared, the Caesar Augustus looked much sorrier than before. Its armor surprisingly only sported a few cracks and craters despite suffering 2 concentrated magazine detonations. Unfortunately, even if its armor retained much of its effectiveness, the more delicate components underneath suffered worse. The amalgamated explosions radiated the combined shock waves of a full sailfellow of missiles. Worse, the propellants of the missiles hadn't been expended at all, so they blew up all at once as well, adding an incinerating quality to the explosions that left the bedraggled Augustus half burning in mechanical agony. What is this? I can't move my mech," the distressed young man said as he kept trying to take control over his mech's twitching limbs. The Augustus is only mortal. Melinda interjected as she guided her mech's foot to crunch the other hand of her opponent's mech into scrap. The Mark Antony ominously leaned over, bringing its menacing and battle-scarred face close to the Augustus' half-smashed and half-burned face. "You're not invincible inside that expensive toy of yours. At least I'm able to afford one in the real universe. You'll get your ass whipped just the same," Melinda noted, then bashed her mace against the Augustus' torso. The cracks expanded, but the armor surprisingly held up against the blunt force trauma she frenziedly inflicted. By the time her mace broke off from the abuse, the enemy pilot's body had long since fallen apart from the excessive shock impacts. Tossing the useless handle away, Melinda walked over and picked up the fallen mech's virtually pristine sword and shield. "Thanks for letting me borrow this, buddy." She swept her gaze at the confused melee around her. Though her duel with the Caesar Augustus expended much out of her mech, it lasted only around 2 minutes. Victory and defeat hadn't been decided yet, but Melinda already pounced at the nearest enemy mech from the flanks. The opponent wasn't able to keep its attention in 2 directions at once, and lost its lower leg to a cruel slice of Melinda's new sword. "This weapon's much better than I thought," she pleasingly muttered, though she missed the crunchy feel of her mace. With Melinda's help, she freed up her preoccupied teammates, leaving them free to help out the others in turn. This caused the scales of battle to tip in their favor rapidly, leading the enemy to a solid rout as their remnants retreated up to the surface. The Mark Antony raised its appropriated sword, causing the survivors to cheer in victory. Despite not having any advantage in the quality of her mech or her league ranking, she still managed to exude the quality of a leader. Most of the mechs who fought alongside of her were willing to follow her directions. Pleased at the deference she enjoyed, Melinda lowered the sword until it pointed towards the exit. "We have a base to wreck. Let's go." The group of mechs squeezed out of the exit and finally reached the surface. Most of the defenders were still stuck guarding against outside attackers, but some of them had already been alerted to the intrusion. "Show me where their control center is located." 6 o'clock, the dome by the tower-like structure. "All right, boys and girls, we've got only one thing left before we can call it a day. To the control center." Despite the many mechs that turned around to take care of the threat that popped up in their midst, the invaders had initiative on their side and they only needed a short time to reach the control center. The hard-shell dome protected it against all kinds of ordnance, but when Melinda crashed the lower edge of her kite shield against the surface, it cracked and started to cave in. Some of the other mechs with melee weapons joined in the fun while the rest fended off the approaching defenders. We can't hold out much longer. Keep it up. We just need a little more time. The Mark Antony's last 3 shield attacks succeeded in prying open a hole. A light mech with a flamethrower immediately went to her side and fired off a lethally hot stream of flame that incinerated all of the control center's personnel and computers. Melinda mentally bathed in their screams, feeling gratified that they accomplished their objective. Melinda. You might not celebrate so soon yet. There's a problem. She snapped out of her funk. What's up, Janet? Well, you guys managed to destroy the control center, but not before they called in the first wave of their reinforcements. You better look up in the sky. Her sensors readjusted. She could see a small speck in the sky growing larger. It was an entry pod, allowing mechs to arrive on the surface of a planet with the speed of free fall. The pod grew larger and larger and larger and larger. That's not a normal pod. The pod was way too big to fit a single mech. From the size of it, Melinda estimated the pod could fit in at least 8 to 12 medium mechs, which was difficult to fend off. Only until the pod engaged its boosters to slow down its downward crash did Melinda feel that something was off. Those boosters released so much force that it rattled the entire comm center. It was as if the boosters were working their ass off, arresting the fall of something much larger than a bunch of regular mechs. An earthquake-like impact rattled everyone in the vicinity as the pod finally half-crashed in the middle of the base. The ramp of the pod lowered slowly, taking its time until it fully extended. That was until a foot the size of a heavy mech kicked the metal ramp away. The rectangular piece of metal screeched as it bounced off the ground only to crash against the base of an antenna. An apocalyptic mech the size of the guard headquarters main building stepped out of the oversized pod. Each footstep seemed to rumble the footing of the other mechs, leading to a growing unease among the blue team. With its sturdy legs, barrel torso, and a pair of weapon-encrusted arms, the metal monstrosity stretched the definition of mech. It's a juggernaut. Janet whispered. In the history of mech development, there was no hard rule that set the size and weight of the mechs to a specific limit. The current modern adoption of the light, medium and heavy classification was more out of convenience than out of any calculated considerations. The doctrines that followed were what really cemented the classifications in place. A light mech is fast and stays alive by remaining unseen or dodging enemy attacks. They usually act as scouts, saboteurs or flankers. They also make excellent flyers. A medium mech is nimble on its feet and can withstand a limited amount of damage. They are the jack of all trades in the mech world, able to fulfill any role with their unparalleled flexibility. A heavy mech doesn't bother dodging, instead choosing to tank all the attacks coming its way. It is regarded as a tank due to the ease it is able to defend a position or break through enemy lines. An entire industry has sprung up around these 3 archetypes. The system of developing and licensing interchangeable and modular components came about when different customers demanded they wanted to mount their favorite toys on their favorite mechs. Many advanced components invented these days restricted their use to a single weight class in order to maintain compatibility. But regardless of this thriving ecosystem of mechs and mech parts, there were always some parties that wanted to take a step forwards for themselves. One such moment happened at the new Rubarth Empire's introduction of the Juggernaut to the battlefield. The Juggernaut was a mech that had the ability to contend against a low-flying spaceship. Its frame and its countless components weighed as much as a dozen heavy mechs, but was about 100 to 1,000 times more expensive to build. The many technologies that kept such a gargantuan in one piece and prevented it from collapsing under its own weight were very expensive to reproduce. Such a large and heavy mech simply didn't appear to be economical. That never stopped the new Rubarthans, though. They painstakingly invested in its development and kept the project under wraps for at least an entire mech generation. Only until they refined the design well enough to be able to operate in hostile planetary environments did they release the first Juggernaut on the battlefield. It left behind a massacre back then. The city it fought in suffered so much damage, the new Rubarthans considered the battle could have resulted in less damage if they fired off a couple of illegal tactical nukes. Right now, the Juggernauts were weapons with dubious legal status in human space. Many states hostile to the new Rubarth Empire sought to draft a treaty banning such ultra-large mechs. The devastating they could unleash rivaled weapons of mass destruction. In actuality, it would be justified if they were categorized as the newest WMD humans have invented. All of that was of little use to Melinda now, as the Juggernaut finally moved. It raised one of its arms that bristled with gun cannons and pointed in the vague direction of Blue Team's military base. Oh shit. Get out, Janet. I'm already on it. The juggernaut fired, and the entire world turned white. What happened after that? Vase asked over the comm as he rested on the couch. Lucky curiously tried to paw Melinda's head projected by the comm. The juggernaut blasted half the walls of the military base apart. It set up a panic in our team. Frankly, the only reason why we lasted so long after the juggernaut entered the field was because its pilot went drunk with power. He destroyed half his team with all the collateral damage he caused. The two spoke about the performance of the Mark Antony, and how Melinda found it to be a good mech despite its many faults. It doesn't have a good place on the front lines due to its scattered strengths. It's not quite a knight, not quite a striker, and its pitiful launchers don't give the mech a lot of long-ranged firepower. Well, I'm only working with the tools I have. Frankly, if I could replace the mace and shield with something sturdier, I'm sure the mech would perform just as well as the Caesar Augustus. Sadly, that's not an option if I want to keep costs and complexity under control. Vase shook his head. I've anticipated most of the issues you've mentioned, but they're kind of built into the fundamental design of the mech. I'm not aiming to replace the Caesar Augustus. I just want to deliver an affordable variant that can perform well in smaller engagements. Melinda nodded. I'm certainly impressed with the mech. I kind of want to replace my patrol mech with it, but I know the pencil pushers in the guard won't allow such a thing. It doesn't have the endurance. After the conversation ended, Vase put the finishing touches on his second-hand made mech and sent it off to be sold in the market. Let's see my progress so far. Status. Name, Vase Larkinson. Profession, novice mech designer. Specializations, none. Design points, 235. Attributes. Strength, 0.7. Dexterity, 0.7. Endurance, 0.6. Intelligence, 1.2. Creativity, 1. Concentration, 1.2. Neural aptitude, F. Skills. Assembly, apprentice minus 3D printer proficiency 1, assembler proficiency 1. Business, apprentice. Computer science, incompetent. Electrical engineering, novice. Mathematics, incompetent. Mechanics, apprentice minus jury rigging 1, speed tuning 1. Metallurgy, apprentice. Metaphysics, incompetent. Physics, novice minus lightweight armor optimization 1, medium weight armor optimization 1. Evaluation, almost reached the standards of an apprentice mech designer. His stats hadn't changed much since the last time he viewed it. His concentration had gained 0.1 points again due to his single-minded focus in mastering the Mark Antony. Besides sleeping, eating, bathroom rituals and taking short breaks to reset his mood, he spent all his time fabricating the Mark Antony. His DP counter remained stubbornly stagnant, further indicating that the sales potential for his Fantasia variants had reached the bottom of the well. Much of his DP came from the 2 Mark Antonys sold so far. They offered much more for a single sale due to their higher value. It doesn't look like my Mark Antony model will catch fire. Vase noted disappointingly. With only a little more than a week left until the YTE, I won't be able to increase my sub-skills or attributes in any meaningful way. While he spent a lot of work designing the Mark Antony then mastering its fabrication process, the things he learned provided marginal help at best when joining the contest. The contest only lasted 1 day, just long enough for mech designers to showcase their skills without boring the audience to a multi-day engineering fest. The day before the main event, the organizers hosted a qualifying round in order to filter out the 8 best contestants. Both events revolved around designing and putting together a functioning mech out of a bunch of parts and a random stripped-down model. It showcased the mech designer's skill in creating new mechs while skipping out the boring part of fabricating the parts from scratch. The old phase without the system probably wouldn't get past the qualifiers. Even with all the additional benefits the system gave him, he might not even be certain he can reach the top 3. I shouldn't be obsessed with trying to reach first place. I have to keep my priorities clear. As long as I can find a single customer for my Mark Antony design, I've already won. The impending interest payment term loomed within a month, which caused Vase to bear immense pressure. I stand a much better chance in the contest if I can earn enough DP to buy the jury rigging 2 sub-skill before it starts. He already experienced the power of jury rigging I. The skill energized with his creativity, allowing him to form unorthodox solutions to complicated technical problems. It did not add any new knowledge, but instead improved his ability to combine the knowledge he already learned into something new. An example would be to strip a laser rifle and turn it onto a shoulder mount. Though such a shoddy modification won't work as well as a purpose-built shoulder weapon, it should work well enough in an emergency. I should get my workshop ready. Vase reminded himself. If all went well, he should be able to find a customer for his new design. He'd have to get his workshop ready and running by the time he got back from the event. First, he took a look at his 3D printer. As a fairly old, second-hand model, it lacked the most current technology in fabrication. Vase meticulously went through the settings of the printer, and with the help of his improved knowledge in assembly, added presets that helped fabricate certain parts easier and with less errors. Then, he looked at his inventory. Besides the raw materials required to produce the HRF armor plating, he lacked pretty much everything else required to build up a Mark Antony. Vase took note of the list of raw materials and visited the local site of the Mech Trade Association. The MTA offered many services to anyone looking to build, buy or sell a mech. It conveniently partnered with resource wholesalers that allowed them to sell various raw materials through a convenient market interface. To fabricate the HRF requires about 11 million bright credits in raw materials. To purchase the rest of the materials requires just 7 million credits. The total cost comes at 18 million credits. If I charge 24 million credits for the Mark Antony, I'll recoup my cost and earn just enough profit to meet my next interest payment. Selling a mech that priced at 24 million credits was much easier than one that demanded more than double the amount. It cost 45 million credits in total to cover the raw materials for the Caesar Augustus. The materials for the Augustus proprietary armor plating cost 38 million credits alone, and Phase lacked the facilities required to process exotic materials into advanced armor plating. These prices look reliable, but it's not entirely reflective of the entire market. Vase noted carefully, remembering what he learned in college about running a business. I'm sure there's plenty of private agreements between a small group of partners that offer substantially lower prices. Vase curiously inspected the market prices for the Caesar Augustus and its close variants. The official base model produced by National Aeromotive sold for a whopping 65 million credits. Naturally, as the original manufacturer and with the now mature Jason Kozlowski at the helm, the CA1 produced by Na was top quality. The few mech designers that have licensed the Caesar Augustus sold the base model or its close variants for around 55 to 60 million credits. Perhaps they also offered lower prices, though they used private sales channels in order to conduct such business. The MTA's internal market site only listed public offerings, which in the mech business is considered the tip of the iceberg. As a tiny mech designer with a one-man business with no reputation, I don't possess the qualifications to seek out deals that are more favorable to me. I can only purchase the materials I require at market prices. This presented a big problem to Vase. The materials needed to build up the frame, power reactor, engines and everything else amounted to 7 million, which is 2 million more than he owed in his upcoming interest payment. As Vase had no ability to draw another loan, he had no way of purchasing the required materials without receiving an advance payment from a customer. That's also going to be a little tricky. The private mech business used to be pretty chaotic. Customers sometimes refused to pay up, leaving the manufacturer in the hole. Sometimes the customer paid on time, but used the new mech they acquired to extort the manufacturer into returning the money. Sometimes, manufacturers also screwed their customers in return. They used substandard materials and inferior components to fool their customers into believing they paid for quality when instead they got nothing but a fake. The establishment of the trans-galactic MTA curtailed most instances of fraud and robbery. Customers looking to buy a reliable mech used the MTA as a middleman. The MTA certified each mech that passed through their hands and made sure the mech conformed to the submitted and agreed upon design between the seller and buyer. Mech designers and manufacturers also benefited from the MTA. For the cost of 1% of a mech sales price, they could take advantage of its many services, such as certification, access to the internal market, to letting them take care of collecting payment from the buyer. It provided a safe platform to do business for many small and medium-sized businesses. The MTA, though officially a charity, also acted as enforcers. They rigidly enforced the prohibitions on installing weapons of mass destruction onto mechs. Any violators caught with dabbling in forbidden dangers like nukes or viruses would be squashed by the MTA dreaded compliance department. Each so-called compliant officer who worked for the MTA were at least expert pilots, with most captains reaching the standard of ace pilots. In comparison, Melinda only reached the standard of advanced pilot, which was the minimum skill requirement to receive a piloting position in the Mech Corps. If I do my business through the MTA, I won't need to worry about the authenticity of the advance payment. My customers will also receive some assurance from the organization. Though Vase had not yet bought anything from the market, he pre-registered his purchase list in order to notify the sellers of those materials that he might buy them soon. It was nothing more than a notification, but the sellers might prepare for the sale by making sure they had the materials in their inventory and could ship them to the Bright Republic. The Bright Republic is small, so shipping times aren't so bad as long as I can find each material in the domestic market. Vase tracked down each material and was relieved there were no problems on that end. With the ultra-fast shipping capabilities of a modern galactic civilization, shipping companies were able to transport all the material stockpiled in Bentheim to Cloudy Curtain in just 2 days. After that, he contacted the MTA to prepare the paperwork for his expected production. Once he signed some standard contracts and agreements with the MTA and the Bright Republic, a representative of the MTA called him in person. The representative invited Vase to go over the legal requirements of producing a mech in the Bright Republic. Your production license covers the permission to produce the weapons that come with the Caesar Augustus. A representative from Bentheim explained over the comm. However, you do not have permission to live-fire these weapons even in tests. Furthermore, you are not allowed to produce your own ordnance. This means you may not produce any missiles even if you have the capability to do so from your license. What about the wrist-mounted laser cannons? They're technically operational as soon as they come off the 3D printer. I just need to plug them to an energy source. The representative swiped a couple of designs to Vase. You need to add safeties during the fabrication process that seals the energy weapons. The files I just sent are small presets for your 3D printer. They will automatically incorporate the most optimal safeties to any weapons you produce, but you should always double-check them manually. Will do. I have one final question. Could you tell me if my design has any appeal to the market? The man from the association smiled. We are always ready to offer advice to young entrepreneurs. As for your variant, it is highly unusual to offer an economy variant of an extremely advanced frame such as the Caesar Augustus. The Augustus already has a small demand. Since you have replaced its armor in your design, thus taking away the biggest merit of that particular model, I cannot be certain whether any potentate is willing to invest in your new concept. There is no existing demand for this kind of product, so you should diligently work on your marketing in order to create demand. Understood. I don't have any more questions, so goodbye. Have a nice day. In other words, Vase had to market his design from the ground up. He couldn't steal any customers from the pilots interested in the base model because they were unwilling to buy an inferior version when they had the money for the real thing. Vase should target pilots with less generous bank accounts, but those pilots usually bought dependable frontline models, not discounted advanced mechs. These two categories differed significantly in terms of endurance, maintenance cost and overall longevity. Regular frontline mechs were built to last. I'll cross that bridge when I get there. For the remainder of the time, Vase kept diligently producing the Mark Antony in his virtual workshop. He accumulated a decent amount of experience in fabricating the most troublesome parts, and with his deep knowledge of the frame and its base model he felt confident he could fabricate a functioning mech with his own equipment. The days passed quickly. The day of departure arrived. The Bright Republic offered free transportation to Bentheim for all contestants. As one of many participants to the annual Young Tigers exhibition, Vase joined the crowd of hopeful pilots at the spaceport while holding Lucky to his chest and leading a floating luggage carrier carrying his clothes and other stuff. Man, I don't know why I'm even coming. Only Grant has a shot of reaching the top 10. A young graduate complained. What do you know? A tall and heavy-set pilot said with a sneer. If you manage to reach the top 200, you'll easily be able to land a job at a reputable mercenary corps. I'm not talking about the 5 or 10-man shows, I'm talking about the real deal, like Pritchard's Bannermen or the Red Bishops. Seriously. No wonder my uncle wanted me to participate. The YTE not only showcases our generation's talent to the Republic, it also acts as a job fair. Plenty of employers are watching the show. If they like a pilot, they don't hesitate to offer a contract. My brother landed a spot with the Crossman that way. The idle chatter of the potentates unintentionally revealed many useful things to Vase. Besides the government and the Mech Corps, he could also expect a lot of mercenaries to attend. Their main purpose was to look for fresh blood to replenish their ranks. It was questionable whether they'd be open to buy a new mech. Vase had his work cut out for him in the next couple of days. The appearance of Vase raised some eyebrows from the pilots and their chaperones. I haven't seen you around in class. One of the men stated as he looked at Vase's collar. Are you sure you've boarded the right shuttle? Every potentate wore a small pin on their collar, chest or arm that denoted their status. It was an exclusive privilege to the 3.5% that marked them special. With it, they enjoyed priority services, had access to VIP sections, and had their safety taken care of first before the rest could take their turn. The entire scheme originated from the new Rubarth Empire, but pretty much every human state other than the Terrans copied the treatment. They also took over the rule that stated that any fraudulent use of such pins invited severe punishment. Security already screened me before letting me in. I'm a participant of the YTE mech design competition. Mech design? A young fresh-faced woman dubiously said. So you're not a pilot? No. That pretty much killed the conversation. The pilots all turned around and went back to their own discussions. The blatant disregard hurt Faze a little, but he had grown used to such behavior ever since he turned 10. Before his genetic aptitude was tested, he behaved just as arrogantly as the other potentates. It took a brutal fall from heaven to realize how conceited he actually behaved. I was a stupid punk back then. I got what I deserved, but the rest ingrained this dismissive behavior. It couldn't be helped. Modern society worshipped martial prowess, and a disproportionate attention was placed on mechs. Sometimes it appeared that society revolved around pleasing potentates. Certainly, placating pilots was important, but the soldiers who bravely enlisted in the other service branches also deserved some honor. Spaceships guarded their borders against capricious aliens while infantrymen occupied territory and cleaned after the messes mechs usually caused when throwing around ordnance. Nothing could be done about it, though, so Faze took the dismissal without complaint. It wasn't as if he achieved anything of note that justified anything more than an absent glance. Only Lucky attracted some attention, but the mostly female pilots were too preoccupied to get distracted by his cuteness. The departure time arrived. The shuttle lifted off after everyone was accounted for. The inter-system shuttle ample power to lift off and escape Cloudy Curtain's atmosphere. Like a sparrow taking flight, the shuttle fluently broke the confines of the planet's gravity and followed a pre-programmed flight out to the nearest Lagrange point in the local star system. Lagrange points provided fast and convenient launch points for FTL. Any shuttle or spaceship capable of traveling faster than light departed from a Lagrange point whenever possible, but were only capable of reaching the edge of a solar system as their destination. While the possibility exists for highly advanced spaceships to arrive at their destination's Lagrange point, the act was considered near suicidal. It was like threading a needle, except one single mistake could cause the ship to smash itself apart in weird gravitational stresses, leaving the debris to fall into the local sun. Everyone played it safe, including the transport shuttle. It took only a moment for the shuttle to reach the nearest Lagrange point. It waited in line as other vessels departed first. Once the shuttle came forward, its sleek and narrow form visibly warped into an elongated form before launching into FTL. The shuttle lurched a little when it entered FTL, but after that the passengers felt nothing else. After hundreds of years of refinement, human FTL technology had earned a track record for safety and reliability. The flight from Cloudy Curtain star system to Bentheim only took less than a day due to Bentheim's favorable gravitational position. It made traveling to the economic heart of the bright Republic convenient. Besides having no one to talk to, Faze enjoyed the flight. Once the shuttle arrived at the edge of Bentheim's star system, it flew towards one of border outposts Bentheim established to meet incoming vessels. Smaller systems such as Cloudy Curtain normally wouldn't bother with this formality, but a major port like Bentheim necessitated increased security checks. Many ships formed an orderly line in the space set with beacons. Small patrol ships flew alongside them, scanning their interior for any contraband while determining their origins and destinations. The shuttle from Cloudy Curtain only warranted a brief scan before being let through by the space security forces. The passenger shuttle nimbly navigated deeper in the system like a fish swimming along a river. It passed by several plotting haulers and heavily armed warships. It kept its distance from rickety-looking mercenary ships and anything else that hinted of danger. After half a day's flight, they finally approached the planetary orbit of Bentheim. From above, the heavily populated planet looked like a paradise that mixed greenery with high-tech urban development. Ever since Bentheim established itself as the premier port of the Republic, the government invested trillions of credits in its ability to accommodate an endless amount of visitors and cargo. The shuttle landed at a crowded spaceport near the capital city called Durham. Faze, the pilots and their chaperones were practically booted out of the shuttle. As soon as they stepped out, the shuttle left in order to make way for another passenger shuttle. Captain Jillian, the lead supervisor of the contestants from Cloudy Curtain, led them to a prepared atmospheric transport that brought them to a hotel near the venue. After leaving the shuttle, they entered the hotel in order to check in and left behind their luggage. All right pilots, the Young Tigers exhibition officially starts tomorrow. You're free for the rest of the day, so go play at the local game center or shop until you run out of credits. I only have a few rules that I hope you can follow for your sake. The captain lifted up a finger. First, be at the venue at 6 o'clock local time. If your comms haven't automatically adjusted their internal clocks, do so now. Tardiness is no excuse. A couple of pilots activated their comms, and some of them had to adjust their settings. Second, you'll be tested for any drugs or intoxicants the moment you enter, so for God's sake don't go party in a club and get smashed. More than a handful of contestants find their qualifications revoked after imbibing a suspicious drink. Don't rule out sabotage from your competitors. There's spies and agents everywhere in the city. This caused a couple of pilots to gulp, though most of them snorted or dismissed the warning as a fantasy. As natives of Cloudy Curtain, the people in power never paid much attention to them. The best pilots of the Republic all graduated from institutions in Bentheim or Rittersburg. Third, do not get into an altercation with your rivals from other pilots. We're all briters here, so don't lower your standing in front of the foreigners. We have guests from all over the star sector here, so keep your roles in mind. The young men and women appeared to listen attentively, but Vase knew most of it would be thrown right out the window a few seconds later. If you break any of these rules, don't expect to participate in the Young Tigers exhibition. You're grown-ups, so bear the consequences of your screw-ups yourself. With the rest of the late afternoon and evening free, Vase exited the hotel holding Lucky against his chest alongside the other participants. The mechanical cat opened its artificial eyes wide as it beheld the exciting view in front of him. The crowded thoroughfares revealed that even at the outskirts, the capital hosted a lot of guests at this time. It was a celebration of martial might, so the Bright Republic hosted a couple of other activities to accompany the event. The mech design competition was just one of many additions. Let's see. Tomorrow's the qualifiers, the day after that is the main event. Once the YTE ends, I'll have to return to Cloudy Curtain immediately if I want to fabricate and deliver my mech in time. Vase had very little time left, so even his free time should be spent on improving his chances of doing well in the competition. Let's visit the mech showrooms. As the commercial capital of a port system, Durham featured hundreds of mech museums, mech dealers, and mech workshops. It featured a healthy local ecosystem that made it convenient for many people in the mech business to run a business. Unfortunately, the rent was prohibitively expensive and the competition was cutthroat. A new entrant with no existing connections to the industry had no chance of establishing a workshop in Durham or anywhere else on Bentheim for that matter. Vase chose to set up his workshop in Cloudy Curtain not just because it was his home, but more due to the low taxes and hassle-free regulations. Besides, shipping stuff to and from Bentheim from Cloudy Curtain isn't expensive at all. It makes little difference except for the difficulty of attracting customers. In a major metropolis like Durham, most avenues and streets featured greenery, art and seating of all kinds. Most transportation traveled far underground or high up in the air, so the bustling city never appeared congested. He entered one of the tunnels, slapped his comm against the scanning block, and waited for a small hovercar to appear before him. A number of passengers including Vase and Lucky entered the car before it closed up and zipped deeper into the heart of the city. Vase opened his comm and studied the map of the city. He entered a few search parameters and found a listing of mech showrooms open to the public. Narrowing the list down further, he was finally left with 3 venues that featured the Caesar Augustus. 2 places showed off the base model, while the remaining showroom hosted a variant. After arriving downtown, Vase took a smaller underground vehicle in order to bring him to the first venue called Bosworth's, a giant branch of one of the biggest commercial dealers of civilian mechs in the Star Sector. With the name of the company emblazoned at the front of the stadium-sized showroom, it attracted countless of pilots and enthusiasts every day. After paying a small fee at the entrance, Vase entered the interior of the showroom and found his way to the section where their Caesar Augustus was hosted. After several minutes of appreciating the other mechs on display, he finally reached one of Bosworth's prized possession. Vase squeezed through a crowd of hundreds as they admired and took pictures of the tall, majestic mech. Seeing it in person made the trip worth it to Vase. He built the mech and several of his personally developed variants many times by hand, but eventually he had to admit his only real experience was in a virtual workshop. How could working with digital code compare to working with real metals and real components? Even from a healthy distance, Vase felt the Caesar Augustus emanate an air of majesty. It was as if the model was an emperor of mechs, and that it was natural for all other mechs to bow before his presence. This craftsmanship is good. It's not a standard model by National Aeromotives, that's for sure. With his deep knowledge of the Caesar Augustus, he noticed a few minute traces that spoke of a different fabrication philosophy than what N.A. or Jason Kozlowski adhered to. These personal touches brought the base model along a different path to its peak. I wonder if the craftsman who worked on this particular model is aware of how he meshed his own thoughts into the model. With his extensive research on the X factor, Faye started to get a rudimentary sixth sense for the phenomenon. He spent plenty of time watching replays of this event Snake and Melinda in action, so he knew vaguely how the X factor was expressed. He tried to identify the vague sensations of emotions the model emanated, however faintly. It feels, the fabricator is old. Experienced. He treated the Augustus as his magnum opus, his best work. He must not have licensed the model himself but got the opportunity to fabricate it once somehow, perhaps because he got hired for a single job. He relished the chance of being involved with building up an advanced mech, so he treated the work reverently. The unconscious feeling of worship the old fabricator felt towards the model unintentionally enhanced the end product's awe. Perhaps that was why Bosworth acquired this particular specimen and showed it off in public. It certainly enhanced the chain's prestige. This was a worthwhile visit. I see now that there's a slightly different way of regarding the Caesar Augustus. Faze naturally refused to adopt such a servile philosophy. He believed that men were masters over the machine. No matter how sophisticated the mech, it's still created as a vehicle for a pilot to protect or destroy. Naturally, with his recent studies of the X factor, his views had adjusted slightly, but only in the sense that mechs performed best when they were created as similar-minded partners to their pilots. There was no need to go overboard and act as if humans were the slaves in this relationship. After the fruitful visit, Vase left Bosworth's and walked down a couple of blocks and visited another company's showroom. Though smaller, the seller mainly sold premium mechs, so it received even more attention from the public. A long line of visitors waited in front of the store and Vase had to cough up a much higher fee to finally enter the premises. Seeing the magnificent mechs all around him made him feel he was in mech heaven. But since he was short on time, he only threw a glance before reaching his destination. The Caesar Augustus Vase saw was virtually identical to the first one. Nevertheless, compared to the previous mech which managed to look imperial, this example seemed diminished. Perhaps it was due to the different lighting, or the fact that other expensive mechs surrounded it, but the mech that Faye seemed diminished. Many people were involved in its construction. The contours and components rigidly adhere to the standards demanded by its design, but that's the only advantage this model has. It's like this model is built by an assembly line. It was a manner of fabricating that spoke of scale, precision and efficiency. Instead of letting one fabricator make all the components by hand, a factory employed many people who all specialize in fabricating one single component. There would be one guy who makes only sensors, another person who's in charge of armor plating, and so on. This specialization ensured they maintained quality while keeping up a decent production pace. One of the worst things that could happen to a large-scale manufacturer is the occurrence of faults, so employing specialists or AIs that could take over such a role was key in maintaining consistency. It works if all you care about is the technical performance of the mech. Vase commented, feeling regretful that the manufacturer had not brought this mech to its full potential. I can't say I blame them. You can't measure X factor. Even though I learned so much, even the most renowned experts must still not have any means of quantifying the X factor. You couldn't put any value in an attribute that couldn't be seen or heard. Plenty of mechs with a high potential of X factor were treated like disposable trash. That was because industry standards favored mass production over individual craftsmanship. Even the mech designers that start a business by themselves let their employees take over the tedious work of fabricating his models when the designer achieved success. They only bothered crafting handmade versions of their mech to familiarize themselves with the model and fix any production issues that might occur. After leaving the showroom, Vase intended to visit the showroom with the customized version of the Augustus. However, after his comm beeped an alert, he knew he had to return to the hotel. The qualifiers for the YTE started tomorrow morning and he had to wake up early in order to make it in time. The time for me to prove myself is about to come. He grinned, relishing the chance to showcase his newly acquired abilities in front of a stage. Bentheim hosted the Young Tigers exhibition in a large, multi-building convention complex built for the purpose. It occupied a gigantic amount of prime real estate that offered plenty of space to the tourists and mech enthusiasts who visited the event. Naturally, the organizers treated mech pilot competition as the main event. The opening ceremony and the introduction of the star pilots commenced while the qualifiers of the mech design competition occurred in a smaller and much less crowded side building. Before he did anything else, Vase checked his status and noticed he finally accumulated 300 DP. With this amount, he immediately bought the jury rigging 2 subskill, which induced another minor headache for him. It made him get ready for the day a bit later than he thought. Even as he rushed his breakfast, he still had to sort out the strange way the system rearranged his brain. Time's almost up. Captain Jillian called at the dining room. Gather at the lobby of the hotel. Vase left his gem cat in his hotel room this time. It was not appropriate for him to bring Lucky along as he competed. Not just because pets weren't allowed, but also due to the possibility of cheating. So he came to the qualifiers alone. Compared to the festive bombast of the main event, the mech designer competition was a subdued event that attracted only a fraction of the crowd. Most of those attending were friends and family of the mech designers. The real crowd would show up tomorrow, when only the 8 best competitors came up on stage. Vase. Wow man, nice to see you. A chubby young man with flaring pink hair spotted Vase and came over with a cheerful smile. Man, we haven't been in touch ever since we graduated. It's like you fell into a black hole. Vase smiled and bumped his former classmate with his fist. Hey Carlos. I've been having some trouble at home. Starting your own mech design workshop is harder than it looks. You actually went through with it. Never mind the hardware, how are you even capable of paying for the licenses? I had a little luck there. Vase proceeded to fill in most of what he did the last 2 months to his friend. Carlos Shaw looked at Vase with a mixed expression. I can't decide whether you're a lucky bastard or not. Only the dumbest grant institutes would give you a production license for the Caesar Augustus. Yeah, I'm still racking my head around trying to reproduce it without getting bankrupt. That's also why I'm here. I have to find a customer for my first mech or else I'm in deep shit. I envy your independence. You should see what I do for a living nowadays. My dad got me a connection to the quality control department of a wholesaler here in Bentheim. Carlos followed the path of many other mech designers who graduated from Rittersberg. They started at the bottom in large corporations. Like many other young graduates, Carlos' current job had nothing to do with mech design in any shape or way. The only thing the job required of him was to test the mechs that the company imported and note which parts were faulty. Carlos might be an average mech designer, but with the things he learned in college he was an overqualified mech technician. Basically, any mech designer that hadn't studied from one of the renowned universities from at least a second-rate human state could forget about entering the world of real mech design. The pathetic state of this industry in the Bright Republic was perhaps the biggest reason why it held this competition. The government wanted to stimulate a domestic mech industry, or at least not become too dependent on foreign transgalactic corporations. They chit-chatted a little more on what they experienced after graduation. After waiting in line, security confirmed their credentials and allowed them to enter the waiting room for contestants. Already about 100 young mech designers sat on the comfortable seats or caught up with their friends and acquaintances. They spotted a few more notable classmates, including the top student Patricia Schneider. Her parents worked at mid-level positions at Bosworth's, which might not sound impressive but represented the apex of local influence in the huge corporation. With Patricia's background, she should have been qualified to study at a prestigious university from a second-rate state. Instead, she stayed in the Bright Republic and attended the Rittersberg University of Technology like the other poor and untalented locals. How much do you think Patricia's chances are of winning first place? About 20%. Carlos casually estimated. I heard she somehow managed to catch the attention of a senior mech designer and became his apprentice. No idea who he is, but that's what people are telling me. They're even saying that the mech designer tutored Patricia during her studies in our college. No wonder she managed to score full marks in every theoretical test. Yeah, thank God she's not as good in practicals, or else she'd wipe the floor of this contest. Rubbing his chin, Vase turned away from Patricia and looked at a couple of other contestants. A few held up their chests in a more confident posture, very unlike a local student. They practically used the same level of superiority as potentates. I've spotted at least 7 Poncis who studied abroad at an elite university, Carlos said, as he was much more familiar with the people he studied with at Rittersberg. I don't know who most of them are, but I do recognize that bastard Edwin McKinney. The young man in question stood in front of a gaggle of admirers. His face oozed as much superiority as all the other elites in the room put together. What's his background? He attended a university in the new Rubarth Empire. Dunno what's the name, but it's Rubarth and so who cares? Even though it's not one of the elite institutions at Astellan, he still prances about his prestige whenever he can. It's as if he's an enlightened gentleman bringing civilization to us savages. Though it sounded ugly, the attention was not unwarranted. Even Vase felt the urge to pick Edwin's brains on the latest development in mechs. Studying mech design in a random NRE university was a wholly different concept than studying the same degree in a backwater country like the Bright Republic. Even the cheapest trash mechs the NRE fielded in their mech core were at least 2 generations. Advanced technologies that sounded like fantasy to Vase was commonplace in those mighty first-rate states. Vase felt a little regret he hadn't studied harder in his teenage years. If he worked hard and achieved better results back then, he might have received the opportunity to attend an elite institution in a second or first-rate state. We live in different worlds. It's no use associating with him. Better focus on your own career. Vase advised, though the real reason he acted nonchalant was because he could rely on the mech designer system to overcome these rivals in the future. It was an advantage he was certain not even the best young mech designers possessed. With its power, he had a real shot at reaching the apex of mech design. All it took was time. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Bright Republic's best and brightest. An attendant gestured the contestants to exit the waiting room. They arrived in front of a podium with all 150 contestants present. They bowed before a crowd of familiar and unfamiliar faces. The presenter was a silver-haired man with a robust voice, likely another veteran of the mech corps. As you can see, it would be too extravagant to allocate a personal workshop and quota of parts to each contestant. With the help of the convention center's holographic projectors, we can nevertheless save space and resources by conducting the qualifiers in a virtual reality with unprecedented realism. A few groans escaped the lips of the contestants. They all wanted to play around with real mech parts and were hopeful this time was different. Now, just like last year, we wish to present our young mech designers with the challenge of designing and assembling a functioning mech from pre-selected parts. It is not a challenge to make a mech work, but it takes skill and talent to create the best mech from suboptimal parts. Your task is to create a mech that will be tested in a standard 10-kilometer guantlet. Your mechs will all be test piloted by Hans over here. Another veteran mech pilot waved his hand from the side. Who is a strict professional and will treat any mech the same? Any questions? How much time do we have? 12 hours from the start of the qualifiers. Are there any limits on weight class and weaponry? The presenter grinned. Design any mech you want at your heart's content. We do not place any limits on the design so long it fits the definition of a mech. Do you want to stick 4 arms on a mech? Fine. Do you want to design a mech with its torso upside down? Go ahead. We specifically enlisted the aid of Hans because he is an all-rounder. He can pilot light, medium and heavy mechs with the same proficiency. He has plenty of experience piloting the most popular animal designs as well. He can kill the same amount of enemies whether he's given a sword or a rifle. Is he an AI? That elicited a bit of laughter from the people present. I can assure you, he is 100% Homo sapiens. That actually reassured Vase. His only advantage over the other contestants was his ability to actualize the X factor in a mech. If his finished product gets tested by an artificial intelligence, then he seriously doubted the emotionally lifeless software program would notice the difference. Very well, if there are no more questions, then please take your place at the designated areas. If you don't possess a tactile implant, then please wear the provided gloves in order to ensure you can move the holographic projections around. Most mech designers had implanted their bodies with technologies that allowed them to touch holograms as if they were real items. It didn't convey the weight of the objects, but it functioned properly enough for today's purposes. On your mark, get set. Go. The empty spaces in front of each participant shimmered as a miniature pile of holographic parts and mech frames littered their view. It looked like someone took out a random pile of parts from a junkyard and put them in front of everyone. The only thing that separated it from junk was that the parts looked new and unused and that every participant had to work with the same parts. When Phase approached a power reactor and tried to touch it, the component enlarged until it reached its real proportions. So that's how they save space here. It made sense to scale down the unused parts. Otherwise the entire venue ran out of space to hold 150 contestants if they all worked on full-scale components. Vase looked around how others fared with the impending challenge. Most looked at the pile of junk and got briefly overwhelmed. Carlos scratched his head as he slowly went over his options. Patricia Schneider immediately chose a fairly standard humanoid internal frame and started sorting through different components to add to her new mech. As for Edwin McKinney, the young elite chose a bold direction for his mech. He chose to pair a lightweight eagle-shaped mech with a robust flight system. Such a combination would result in a flyer that hovers between the light and medium weight class, which was not a good area to fall into. Vase suspected that Edwin had a few surprises in store. As for his own design, he took a brief look at the components available. Most of the parts seemed outdated, roughly around 2 to 4 generations old. In Iron Spirit, these parts would be considered 3-star or 4-star parts, somewhat advanced for novice mech designers but not to the point of overwhelming them if they stuck to the simpler parts. The standard parts were all within his competence. Instead of starting to pick the parts he preferred, Vase took a different approach. He studied Hans, the test pilot for his competition design, and thought about the presenter's description of him. If Vase wanted to make it out of the qualifiers, he had to use his strengths, and that meant integrating the X factor into his design. It's a risk if I go this route. If I let my emotions instead of logic drive my design, then I won't make the most optimal choices. Other mechs will have better specs than mine. Yet what does it matter if his mech performed worse than other mechs by 5% or so? Only the mechs that performed the best in the gauntlet made it through the qualifiers. No matter how many bells and whistles a designer added to the mech, if Hans didn't use it to its full potential, then it wasn't a good design. The product had to fit the pilot, not the mech designer's preferences. What kind of mech does Hans prefer to pilot the most? Too bad Phase wasn't allowed to access the galactic net during this competition. He only had the brief story from the presenter to make a guess. What was this pilot's greatest strength? Versatility. Hans could pilot almost every mech in the market. That took a lot of training. This man dedicated much of his piloting career learning how to pilot many different kinds of mechs. He practiced shoring up both his melee and ranged weapon skill until he could use them interchangeably without affecting his battle strength. Perhaps it was a coincidence, but Phase thought a mech like the Mark Antony fit Hans well. The medium mech offered maximum flexibility, allowing Hans to dodge attacks that could be dodged and tank what he could withstand. With a mace and shield, Hans could tear any mech apart except for heavy knights, and with his wrist-mounted laser cannons he could shoot down anyone from mid-range. The lack of endurance wouldn't be much of an issue, considering the mech only had to go through a short but intensive 10-kilometer gauntlet. There's no need to seek out a particular extreme. If I have the chance to use my familiarity to my advantage, then I should take it. There's no shame in using a design I know well as a reference. As long as my design can do the job, then Hans will easily pass through the gauntlet. Vase finally stepped forward and picked a couple of promising but also fitting components. He envisioned the mech he had in mind for a pilot with a broad set of skills. First, the mech should be a medium weight in order to maintain the mech's flexibility. The mech should be a flyer, but the wings don't need to be strong. Flight is just a means to an end. Next, it needs a balanced focus on melee and ranged offensive options. What Phase imagined Hans preferred to pilot was a workhorse model. It shouldn't be too fancy, and it doesn't need all the bells and whistles. The design needed to do the job and nothing more. Through this process of thought, Vase imagined the competition organizers implied much more than what they revealed on the surface. They presented us with a pile of parts, some of them more advanced than we ought to know how to handle. Vase shook his head and glanced at his fellow mech designers who seemingly went crazy at the possibilities. It's actually a subtle trap. If we get carried away with forcing an advanced component into an unsuitable design, then Hans won't be able to perform that well and won't be able to endure in the gauntlet. Vase felt a little confident in his chances now. While the likes of Patricia and Edwin remained superior contestants, he felt he stood a chance of making it in the bottom of the top 8. Let's see if I can recreate the ghetto version of the Mark Antony with these parts. Vase started selecting his parts, all the while keeping his intentions honed to a specific image. He wanted to build a versatile workhorse, a mech that doesn't have flashy features but is able to use the tools it has to their fullest effect. Building a mech started with the internal frame. As the basic skeleton of the mech, it determined the mech's shape, height, and weight capacity. A sturdy mech not only demanded strong armor, but also a robust internal frame that could hold up its weight under pressure. There were many frames to choose from. Most adopted a standard humanoid shape of 2 arms, 2 legs and an upright posture. Some looked like cats, others like birds and reptiles. Each form had its advantages and disadvantages, but generally the humanoid mechs offered great balance as long as its 2 legs remained intact. As Vase wanted to design a mech with flight capabilities, he chose to pick a medium frame that was on the lighter side. The frame's construction featured a clever arrangement of gaps, hollows and grooves. It saved a lot of weight while keeping its structural integrity intact as much as possible, though not always succeeding. Nevertheless, the frame held up to stresses as long as it wasn't used too heavily for years. Fortunately, the contest also automatically supplied the compatible artificial musculature. Though for the best original designs, it was best to form it from scratch, the amount of time it took was immense compared to borrowing an existing design scheme. Next up, Phase considered the contour of the mech and the configuration of the limbs. Humanoid mechs differed widely in size, bulk, thickness and so on. While some designers preferred to complete the internals first before considering the exterior, Vase wanted to do the opposite in order to set his limits beforehand. He already had a purpose in mind for his mech, so it was important he get the outer appearance of the mech done first in order to make it easier for him to visualize his intentions. First up, the legs. As the mech's base, the legs determine the machine's speed, weight limit and stability. Humanoid mechs boasted a wide variety of legs, from ones that specialized in long-distance efficiency to those that came built-in with boosters to facilitate powerful jumps. Vase envisioned a mobile medium mech, so he kept his selection limited to the lighter armored legs. He patiently dug through the pile of junk for a suitable pair of leg design schemes. God, these legs are shit. Vase muttered as he dropped the next pair of legs in disgust. Most legs he encountered were either light but frail, or sturdy but too heavy for his tastes. It was as if the organizers didn't want contestants to settle for boring, mediocre legs with the most optimal compromise between armor and speed. It's impossible for me to pick a heavy pair of legs if I want my mech to be capable of at least a modicum of flight. I would either have to pick a pair of skinny legs, or... As Vase looked at the pile of animal-shaped legs, his newly upgraded jury-rigging sub-skill tingled in excitement. Mech components and parts had always been designed to accommodate a certain level of modular compatibility, but Vase had seldom heard of cases where a designer attached animal legs to a humanoid upper body. Such things were possible, but it brought a lot of problems concerning reworking the musculature and making sure the mech's walking and running posture remained balanced. These raptor legs look ideal. He approached the pile and highlighted a pair of fairly robust raptor legs. Raptor-shaped mechs usually featured powerful running gaits that provided fairly good speed at a good amount of endurance. However, they were designed in a way that attached them to the sides of the waist instead of the bottom. Trying to mate the legs to the torso of his mech would take a lot of thinking. Let's finish the rest of my selection before I figure this out. The size of the torso determined the maximum size of the engines, power reactor and cockpit. Larger components were generally more powerful, but Vase had to keep the total weight below the total lifting capacity of the legs. Furthermore, certain shapes offered more advantages than others. Lean feminine torsos were light, barrel-shaped torsos offered lots of volume, V-shaped torsos looked incredibly masculine and offered expanded volume at the upper end of a mech. What Vase ultimately chose was a fairly broad torso out of the available parts. It provided a good amount of space at the bottom side of the mech, allowing for more extensive modifications in order to make it compatible with his raptor legs. While the torso weighed heavier than Vase would have liked, it was still within tolerance. The arms followed next. Raptor mechs usually chose to work with smaller arms or converted them to weapon mounts. As the unfinished design needed to be capable in both melee and ranged combat, Vase started looking for a fairly robust arms that were capable of mounting wrist-mounted weaponry. There's nothing suitable here. The selection is too limited. Most of the humanoid arms in the junk pile were bare arms. Cheap, sturdy and a form factor that allowed for pilots to synchronize with them to up to 100%, these arms specialized in wielding mech-sized firearms. Some arms also specialized in wielding melee weapons, featuring strength and musculature and higher gripping strength. I think I'm going to have to clunk something together again. Vase concluded as he skipped the unorthodox-shaped arms. He lacked the time to work on fitting both the animal-shaped arms and legs onto a humanoid mech. He settled with a pair of thicker arms that performed well in melee combat. With some effort, he might be able to attach some sort of ranged weapon to it, though its performance would suffer if he rushed the implementation. Next up was the head. It was the least important limb of a mech, since all heads pretty much offered the same options except for the lightest and heaviest configurations. Vase toyed with picking a reptilian head, but he discarded it and picked a human one in order to avoid making his mech too flamboyant and ruin its theme. A regular human head did the job just as well. Now, the flight system. What Vase had in mind was a mech that could traverse short distances quickly. The gauntlet only lasted a short time, so the flight system would not need to focus on efficiency and reaching high speeds. Unfortunately, the ideal flight system that Vase wanted were not available. What he saw were mostly large, sweeping wings that provided a great amount of aerial mobility, but also painted giant targets on the mech's back. It wouldn't survive a 10 km gauntlet intact. He eventually picked a sturdy but large pair of wings designed for medium mechs. Vase preferred it over the others due to its lift-off power and its ability to operate even under heavy damage. He had a use for that last attribute. I'll have to finish picking parts first. For the internals, his design called for prioritizing durability. It had to hold up even when the mech was being banged around a lot. He picked a powerful engine, one that provided lots of power at the cost of horrible energy efficiency. For the power reactor, he went for a slightly underpowered one, but it was the only one that left enough space for the engines within the mech's internal structure. In order to power the mech sufficiently for the entire gauntlet, Vase added in lots of capacitor energy cells for a quick boost of instant energy. The sensors he chose were some of the most durable ones available, meant for a heavy gorilla mech. They provided no guidance or targeting assistance, but their viewing range was decent, and besides, their toughness was almost as good as armor. That should do it for the basics. Vase thought as he scanned the components again in order to make sure he hadn't missed anything. I'll look at weapons later. First, he had to put the basics together. First, he needed to make adjustments to the internal frame in order to accommodate the raptor legs. If Vase wanted to do it perfectly, he'd use the mech designer system's many tools to redirect certain mechanical components in order to achieve a sideways attachment. Unfortunately, his comm was disabled, and even if it were not, he'd be stupid to reveal the system. So he used the basic designer program provided to every contestant and made some crude and drastic changes. He creatively applied his jury rigging skills to clunk something up between the legs and the lower torso. It took a little more time than expected, but by the time he finished, the legs appeared to work decently in the simulator, though there was a higher than expected loss in the conversion of motive power. Still, Vase shrugged off the losses, focusing instead on his gains. As long as his vision of a versatile workhorse mech could be achieved, the sacrifices were worth it. Though this mech is going to look like a very strange horse once I'm done with its design. He spent the next 2 hours carefully integrating the engine, power reactor and cockpit inside the torso. After adding in some other minor components such as the energy cells, he attached the torso to the modified raptor legs. The balance was a little off, but Vase could adjust it later. First he had to finish attaching limbs. After the troublesome legs, it was a breeze attaching the head to the torso. Vase only made minor adjustments to the bog-standard human head in order to accommodate the gorilla sensors. The arms took a bit of effort to attach to the torso. Though not as extreme as with the legs, the arms were designed to accommodate a different chest profile, so Vase had to shave off and flatten a few bits in order to clunk the disparate parts together. The designer provided by the organizers locked a lot of advanced features. However, it did automate a lot of the most tedious and time-consuming work that did not really showcase the strengths of the designers working with it. The software's powerful processors automatically took care of laying down power cables and piping according to industry standard. What the designers could do after that was spend some time adjusting them in order to optimize their placements. In his case, Vase had to rework major sections of cabling between the waist and the legs. Somehow the standard software got confused when it tried to mate the connections between the two incompatible components. Only 4 hours remained after he finished putting together the limbs and the internals. The mech possessed the minimum qualifications to present itself as a complete machine, but it wouldn't survive the gauntlet this bare. The flight system came up next. Vase wanted his mech to be mobile in order to add to its options, but he didn't want the wings to dominate the mech and burden it excessively. So he straightforwardly cut off major portions of the wings, especially the parts that extended too far from the back. It left the flight system looking clipped. I cut over 60% of the parts but still managed to retain 30% of its thrust. It was a fairly generous ratio, helped by the fact the manufacturers paid attention to this issue. Most wings that lost so much length only provided enough flight capability to allow the mech a controlled crash. The wings Vase was left with weren't powerful, but they provided a sufficient amount of traversing speed, though he shouldn't expect the wings to let the mech fly high. Attaching the wings to the torso provided little trouble. Despite the fact that the torso wasn't built for flying, it still possessed all the modular connectors that eased the fusion between the two parts. The flight system looked remarkably compact compared to the larger and heavier torso, but that was the image he was going for. The smaller the wings, the longer they stayed intact. It kind of looks like a dragon bred with a human who delivered this mech into the world. The raptor legs provided the mech with a lot of leg power and mobility while still able to bear a generous amount of weight. Together with the hefty torso and arms, the mech's weight classification was approaching the upper limits of the medium standard, though it was not as bad as the Caesar Augustus and its variants. The wings provided enough thrust for the mech to help it move around as long as its weapon loadout wasn't excessive. The great thing about the junk pile was that Vase could pick the best weapons from it without worrying about licenses and fabrication. He rummaged through the pile and found a fairly thin but serviceable sword. He added a pair of lightweight backup knives before picking up a medium-sized round shield for defense. This took care of the mech's close-quarters combat needs. The ranged options were bound to be trickier. The mech only had 2 arms, enough for it to carry the sword and shield. He'd either have to resort to external add-ons, or force the mech to holster its unused weapons on its lower back, which did not offer much space due to the wings. Vase also wanted the ranged option to be something other than an afterthought. Unfortunately, that was difficult if he wanted a weapon that could pack a punch while simultaneously keep the mech light enough to maintain its mobility. His experience with the Caesar Augustus and the Mark Antony taught him that a pair of mid-powered laser cannons did not kill opponents fast enough, so for a ranged option he also needed a weapon that packed a punch. This was very difficult to deal with. As the time limit grew closer, Vase felt a little anxiety infect his mood, which he absolutely did not want. He took a small break from tinkering and refreshed his mind by having a small meal and taking care of his bathroom needs. Once he exited the toilets, he regained sufficient calm that he was able to focus on envisioning his desired mech again. He thought up a bold idea when he took a leak. It would test his jury rigging as well as many of his other skills, but if it worked, the mech could gain a short-term ranged kill capability. As ballistic weapons weighed too much and missile weapons lasted too short, Vase chose to take a pair of high-powered laser rifles as his weapon of choice. The rifles the junk pile offered packed a lot of punch, but were prone to overheating and gobbled up energy like there was no tomorrow. The first thing he did was strip their stock, optical sight and other useless doodads. Then he took a pile of light armor plating and crafted a rectangular shell around the rifle as protection. He then stuffed as much energy cells as possible within the casing, and linked it all to the rifle as its primary energy source. He then took a pair of turreted ballistic cannons, cut off their swivels and crudely welded the armored laser cannons onto it. After that, he installed the slightly oversized pair of boxes onto his new mech shoulders. The mech had reached its limits in terms of weight, but the shoulder-mounted laser rifles offered substantial firepower at a distance as long as they didn't overheat. Vase spent the remainder of the time refining the coordination between the different parts. He especially had to recheck the programming of the swivels, and made sure that it acted according to the characteristics of energy weapons instead of ballistic weaponry. As his strange, crude Frankenstein of a mech came into being, he attracted a fair amount of unflattering attention. Compared to the elegant lines of Patricia's mech, this boy's work is a total mess. I don't know why he even bothers with the runty wings. It's not like the mech's going to fly in the first place with all that weight. Vase took no notice of the jeers. He knew his mech better than anyone else. The mech would work as advertised, at least for the duration of the gauntlet. Alongside its formation, Vase tried to keep his intent focused on one single concept, and he felt he did a decent job with all the limitations surrounding this contest. He wasn't able to fabricate the parts by hand, and most of them were also designed for mechs fulfilling different purposes. Such a disparate gathering of parts might even nullify the X factor entirely. I'm taking a big gamble here, but I'm confident I'm not wrong in taking this route. His strange mech married a humanoid upper form with a pair of raptor legs and some limited flight capabilities, so he named it the Drake. The mech carried his hopes of a victory in the qualifiers, and therefore allow him to come up to the big stage tomorrow where he could gather plenty of attention. Enough to attract a customer, Vase hoped. Time is almost up. Please finalize your designs. When the presenter finally announced the end of the design phase of the competition, a lot of young men and women groaned. While Vase was able to finish his mech with a bit of time to spare, other designers lacked the skill to jury-rig disparate components together without spending a lot of time making the connection work. You gave us too little time. A young woman complained as tears fell from her stressful face. The mech she worked on only appeared half-finished. Give us more time. 12 hours is too little. This is unfair. Silence. The presenter ordered with a bloody air, instantly causing the designers to quail. The terms of the qualifiers are published beforehand, so you should have prepared for this round. Last year's qualifiers also took 12 hours. We're on a tight timetable here, and the main round happens tomorrow. We won't postpone the event just so you can put the finishing touches on your work. When Vase looked around to see the progress of his fellow contestants, he judged about a third of them hadn't finished their designs. Many people tripped up because they spent too much time forcing components designed for different mechs to work together. Such failures proved they didn't possess much knowledge beyond the basics in mech design. It was interesting to see that the organizers place a lot of emphasis on this when holding the qualifiers. Some other designers lost too much time due to faulty judgment. One heavy mech featured highly advanced engines and power reactor. That was all fine and dandy, but the designer spent way too much time adding a lot of toys to make full use of that capacity. If he kept the 12-hour limit in mind and kept his choices modest, he could have made it through with his level of skill. In general, the contestants who left unfinished designs at the end of the period chewed more than they could handle. If they picked simpler, less mechanically complex components out of the pile of junk, then they'd at least leave a functioning mech at the end, showcasing their competence in working under pressure. Although I can't say I blame them for being ambitious. Vase might have been one of these losers if his father hadn't left him the system. If he was participating in the contest and wanted to have a shot at getting past the qualifiers, then he couldn't settle for average among 150 other contestants. The mech had to perform better than almost anyone else's work, so taking risks was unavoidable. As he looked at the dejected contestants who were forced to give up on the qualifiers due to their incomplete designs, Vase felt a little guilty he cheated his way out of this circumstance. Before the system's arrival, Vase was like any other novice mech designer who graduated from a local university. He possessed basic knowledge but never excelled at anything other than mechanics, and even that impressed no one because he learned outdated techniques that would be laughed at in more advanced states. His father gave him the system to circumvent years of dedicated study and experience. Why did he deserve to benefit from this miracle when many other of his former classmates were left to wallow in their mediocrity? He wasn't a saint, he never donated to charity, he wasn't even nearly as good in his studies as some of the others. There's no point dwelling on these feelings. I'm different from the others. They all made their choices in life when they chose to go down the path of mech designing. The mech design career path was one that led to fame, riches and prestige. However, it was also a cutthroat business that couldn't fit too many competitors. For every designer that clawed its way to the top, at least hundreds or thousands of others were resigned to lesser jobs like full-time fabrication or maintenance of other people's mechs. After sending off the losers, the presenter gestured to those who were still in contention. Please clear the main stage and stand to the side. Our pilot Hans will soon test the bold designs our young talents have whipped up. A very fancy simulation pod was brought at the very rear of the stage. Hans, fitted out in a skin-tight piloting suit, waved at the audience before entering the pod. The venue darkened and the stage began to light up in a fully realistic projection of a slim but elegant light mech wielding a polyarm twice as long. The rest of the environment lighted up after that, showing hints of the urban landscape ahead that represented the testing grounds for all of the mechs. First up is a creation by Natalie Montig. Hans will put mech the Lance Star to the test after 5 minutes of acclimatization. This preparation period applies to all other mechs tested today. Carlos walked over to Vase and whistled at the polished design in the projection. Natalie sure worked her magic. She's always been a light mech fanatic. She spent too much time polishing the exterior. I'm not sure the internals underneath the armor can withstand heavy duty. Vase judged with a critical eye. 12 hours left designers with too little time to create a good mech. Give them a week, and most of the contestants here could roll out designs that performed at least 50 to 100% better than what they rushed out. Eliminating errors and weak points in the design offered the biggest bump in performance and could be done in 2 to 4 days, while constant optimizations allowed the mech to perform a little better over the remainder of the time. When Hans finished familiarizing himself with the Lance Star, he entered the testing stage. The presenter offered spectators an overview of the gauntlet. As everyone knows, testing a mech as fair as possible can be difficult. Many smart people have racked their overstuffed brains to find a solution before coming up with the gauntlet. They come in different lengths, duration and difficulties, and randomize in configuration with each separate run. That means that Hans will face similar challenges with each mech he pilots without being able to use his last run's experience to help him overcome his current challenges. Technically, since no run was the same, their difficulties actually diverged in many different ways. If Hans faced smooth sailing up to the end where he get whacked by an overwhelming ambush, he'd be able to score higher than in many other situations. For example, if he faced constant harassment right at the start, leading to his mech's destruction midway due to his inability to find time to recover. In both gauntlet runs, the amount of mechs and their strength remained the same, but the way they exerted pressure differed drastically, leading to different results. There was no point complaining about it though. Vase knew that the gauntlet was a long-held custom in the mech world, and that its inventors had plenty of time to curb much of its faults. The Lance Star moved. Its thin and lightweight design spoke of a great retention and motive power. Natalie Montig evidently possessed real skill for getting a mech traverse so smoothly. The machine flitted through the debris-filled streets of the gauntlet like a dancer. When the Lance Star encountered enemies, Hans piloted the mech as a high-speed scout. It dodged aside the attacks sent in its way and avoided traps and entanglement whenever possible. If a mech was able to come up to its front and present an obstacle, the Lance Star only dealt enough damage with its lance and auxiliary pistol to squeeze its way through. Natalie's mech started stumbling when Hans couldn't avoid a couple of laser beams. The Gauntet's computer-controlled opponents might not be very smart or skilled, but they possessed overwhelming numbers, so it was impossible to keep out of reach no matter how many times Hans dodged. Ouch. Carlos winced. The mech is getting bogged down and surrounded. It doesn't have enough firepower to break through. The Lance Star only used its polearm as its main weapon. It possessed no ranged weapons at all. Hans had no way to pressure his opponents at a distance. When more and more opponents gathered at range, the Lance Star finally suffered a critical hit in its thinly armored ankle. This practically halved the light mech's mobility, leading to the mech getting hit much more often. It lasted a respectable amount of time and took out a few more mechs in its death throes, but the simulation finally ended at its destruction. The presenter came back in focus as the simulation projected a lot of statistics, such as the distance traversed and how many opponents the mech took out of action. The Lance Star has reached a distance of 7 kilometers, during which it killed 5 mechs and damaged 20 more. I don't know about you guys, but I think this is a great performance for a mech put together in just 12 hours. The crowd offered a polite applause. Natalie was too conservative in her design, which led to the Lance Star's one-dimensional performance. Other than its speed and lack of major design flaws, the mech boasted no other advantages. A heavy mech called the Thunderstorm came up next. It possessed a quadrupedal design, its 4 heavy legs supporting an incredibly tough and stable firing platform. The mech looked a little strange as the upper body of the mech sported 2 thick cannons as its arms. The presenter introduced the mech and its designer briefly as everyone waited for the 5 minutes of preparation to pass. When Hans stepped out into the streets, the Thunderstorm rolled over the mechs in the vicinity. Its prodigious firepower, with its main weapon being 2 ballistic cannons, destroyed every mech if they got hit a couple of times. Though slow and inaccurate against light mechs, the Thunderstorm also incorporated half a dozen laser mounts on its shoulders and back to fend them off. A substantial volley of missiles fired from a kilometer away. They arced upwards into the sky, following a parabolic trajectory as they rocketed downwards towards the Thunderstorm. Hans hastily turned around and fired his lasers in rapid-fire mode in order to shoot down the missiles, but this left him vulnerable to the other light mechs again, who all took advantage of the opening to slip in some damage. The missiles hadn't delivered too much damage, as the Thunderstorm still had plenty of armor to spare. But as Hans piloted the heavy mech forwards while trying to destroy as many enemies as possible, the missiles continued to pour in from above, each wave leaving behind more explosions and more damage. The sad thing about the Thunderstorm was that it performed well enough against enemies in reach, but offered no solution to the constant long-range missile bombardment. The mech possessed almost no mobility, allowing the missileer to stay out of reach. With no line of sight nor a set of targeting data, Hans couldn't even switch his cannons to artillery mode and fire back lobbing shells. He tried a few times when the combat reached a lull, but it obviously represented nothing more than a gamble with very long odds. When the Thunderstorm finally got wrecked by all the missiles, the presenter came back on stage and analyzed the statistics. I am mightily impressed with the Thunderstorm. Hans achieved a whopping 30 kills and damaged twice as many other mechs. While he hasn't moved far from his starting point, his damage scores are more than ample enough to vindicate this mech. The main goal of the gauntlet was to get the mech to pass through 10 kilometers. Regardless of success, a run was scored on damage inflicted and distance reached. This gave both light and heavy mechs an equal chance in reaching a high evaluation. Yet for every mildly successful run, at least 3 more failed spectacularly. One medium mech sported a highly visible gap in its arm connections. The mech's armor couldn't cover up the musculature of the arms, leaving them prone to damage. Even with Hans' best efforts, a couple of missile strikes fouled the connectors pretty quickly, leaving the mech with only barely functioning arms. Suffice to say, the handicapped mech hadn't lasted long at all. Another mech was designed as a solid, sturdy knight with an excellent sword and shield. However, when Hans put its endurance to the test, a solid cannon shell to the chest disrupted the mech's internals. The knight's sturdy exterior covered up a bevy of flaws, most of them related to sloppy work into putting the internals together. The big hit practically disrupted the engine's connections, leading to a heavy slowdown in the knight's operation. In addition, due to the loss in strength, its sword was unable to strike down opponents. Someone next to Vase shook his head. Again, it's a shame we weren't given a lot of time. It's so bullshit. When Carlos Mech came up to the stage, the young man in question hugged Vase in a show of nervousness. Damn it, I hope my baby will do well. This is the first time my creation is tested in public. I hope I won't disappoint my parents. The mech Carlos spent 12 hours on looked like an ill-fitting mess. With its oversized legs, the humanoid mech seemed confused whether it wanted to be a medium or heavy mech. Carlos evidently faced the same problem as Vase, but solved the problem by going into a different direction. Though people often disparaged medium-heavy hybrids, the huntsman Carlos cobbled up performed fairly better than anyone expected. The legs caused the mech to move slower than normal, but it also became incredibly resistant to damage. With a shield in one arm and an awkward sawed-off heavy rifle in the other, the mech gunned down plenty of mechs in its way. However, the lack of melee options dragged the huntsman down. It was only able to deal with mechs that came close by dropping the rifle and unsheath its backup knife. This turned the mech into a competent defender, but allowed the rifle mechs in the distance to shoot at the huntsman with impunity. This envelopment eventually resulted in the huntsman's death. The presenter gave the huntsman an average evaluation. It did not do very well, but at least it hadn't failed outright in the gauntlet. Vase wrapped his arm around Carlos and tried to cheer him up from his dispirited mood. You did quite well there. You've proven yourself at the stage that you have the chops to be a mech designer. Yeah, but my score is way behind. Never mind the top 8, I can't even reach the top 32. All of the people who score that high are talents. Vase sighed even as he figured he was also one of them. Don't aim too high. You've got opportunities many of your other colleagues wish they have. His job working on quality control at a large manufacturer was facilitated through connections from his parents. Carlos had stepped one foot in the mech designer industry. After a couple of decades of working up the ladder, Carlos could have the opportunity to join a mech design team and contribute his rich knowledge to the formation of a new design. Up next is our lovely Patricia Schneider's Rosaria. The announcement attracted everyone's attention. The top graduate of this year's cohort was about to show her fangs. Like and subscribe.